Asterisk. The emergency signal came screaming across 1,000 light-years of empty space. And Ambassador Thelvan felt her heart freeze in her chest when she heard it. Cath 7 was dying. The mining colony sat on the edge of Confederacy space, far from any military protection, and now 40,000 of her people huddled underground while the Drekvith burned their world above them. She had seen the reports, the terrible images captured by satellite before the orbital stations went dark. And she knew what the Drekvith did to the worlds they conquered. They did not simply kill, they enslaved, they tortured. They broke entire civilizations into pieces and sold those pieces across the black markets of a dozen galaxies. And now they had come for Keth 7. Thelvan stood in the communications center of Station Arclight, her pale blue skin growing paler by the second as she reviewed the tactical data streaming across her screen. The Drekvith had brought 40 warships, each one bristling with weapons that could crack a planet's crust. The colony's shields would fail within hours. The nearest Confederacy fleet was 3 weeks away at maximum speed. There was no hope, no logical, reasonable hope. But Thelvan had not survived 60 years of diplomatic service by accepting the logical answer when lives hung in the balance. She turned to her aide, a young Valorian barely past his first molting, and spoke in a voice that trembled only slightly. "Contact the human embassy," she said. "Tell them I require an immediate audience with Director Chen." The aide's tendrils curled with confusion. The human's ambassador? Their nearest military assets are even further than our own fleet. "Do it," Thelvan commanded. And something in her voice killed any further argument. She had heard stories about humans. Everyone in the galaxy had heard stories. They were a young species, barely 2 centuries removed from their first ventures into space. But in that short time, they had carved a reputation that made older civilizations nervous. They were persistent in ways that seemed almost pathological. They formed emotional bonds with anything and everything, from their fellow humans to alien species to simple machines. And when those bonds were threatened, when something they cared about was in danger, they became something else entirely, something that made the Drekvith look almost gentle by comparison. Holographic image of Director Chen flickered to life in front of Thelvan within. Minutes Chen was a small woman by human standards. Her dark hair streaked with gray, her face carrying the kind of scars that spoke of violence survived. Her eyes were the most unsettling thing about her. Calm and steady and utterly without fear, "Ambassador Thelvan," Chen said, her voice carrying the strange warmth that humans seemed to inject into everything. "I received your urgent summons, and I can see from your expression that something terrible has happened." The Thelvan transmitted the data packet without preamble, watching Chen's face as the human absorbed the scope of the disaster for a long moment. Chen said nothing. Her eyes moved across invisible screens, processing information at a speed that Thelvan found difficult to follow. Then Chen went still, completely, absolutely still, in a way that made Thelvan's skin prickle with ancient prey instincts. 40,000 civilians, Chen said softly. And her voice had changed, grown harder and colder, and somehow more dangerous. 40 Drekvith warships, Thelvan confirmed. "Ambassador, I know this is an impossible request, but I must ask if humanity has any assets that could..." "Coordinates received," Chen interrupted. And Thelvan blinked in surprise. "Director, I haven't finished explaining the..." "You don't need to," Chen said. And now she was typing commands into a console that Thelvan couldn't see. "We have a ship in range, and it's already altering course." Thelvan's tendrils went rigid with shock. "One ship? Against 40 Drekvith war vessels?" "Director Chen, I appreciate the gesture, but a single ship cannot possibly..." "Ambassador," Chen said. And her voice cut through Thelvan's protests like a blade through silk. "You misunderstand me. and I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." She leaned forward, and in the holographic display, her scarred face seemed to fill Thelvan's entire field of vision. "I'm not sending a ship," Chun said. "I'm sending the ship, and the people aboard it are not soldiers in any sense that you would understand." "Then what are they?" Chun's smile was not a pleasant thing to witness. "The vessel is called the Gehenna, and it carries the Death Row Battalion, which means it is crewed by 700 of the most dangerous humans who have ever lived." Thelvan felt something cold settle into her stomachs. "Death Row," she repeated, her translator struggling with the unfamiliar term. "This is a punishment designation?" "These are humans who have been sentenced to death for their crimes," Chun explained, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "Murderers, war criminals, the violently insane. And they have been given a choice: die in a cell, or die fighting humanity's enemies. You send your criminals to fight your wars? We send our monsters to fight other monsters," Chun corrected. "The damned, we call them. And most don't survive their first deployment because the missions we send them on are the ones no sane commander would accept." Thelvan's mind reeled as she tried to process what she was hearing. "And this ship, this Gehenna, it's crewed entirely by such individuals?" 700 convicted killers, each one wearing an explosive collar that will vaporize their skull if they step out of line, Chun confirmed. "They have no hope of freedom, no chance of parole, and nothing left to lose except the opportunity to die for something that matters. This is madness. This is humanity." "Ambassador," Chun's image flickered as she prepared to end the transmission. "The Gehenna will arrive at Kef 7 in approximately 6 hours. And I want you to understand something very important about what's going to happen next." "What is that?" Chun's eyes met Thelvan's across the vast distance between them, and in those eyes, Thelvan saw something that she would never forget for as long as she lived it. Was pity not for the Valorian colonists, for the Drakevith. "The Drakevith think they're predators," Chen said softly. "They think they understand violence, that they have mastered the art of making other species afraid. But they have never met humans like the ones aboard the Gehenna." She paused. "They have never met people who have already died inside, who have nothing left except the burning need to take as many enemies with them as possible. And Ambassador, I promise you this." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The Drakevith are about to learn what fear really means." The transmission ended. Thelvan stood alone in the communication center, her heart's pounding against her ribs, and she found herself wondering if she had just saved her people or doomed them to something even worse than. She remembered the images from Kef 7, the burning cities and the screaming civilians, and she made her peace with whatever was coming. If monsters were what it took to save 40,000 lives, then she would welcome the monsters. She just hoped she could live with the consequences. The Gehenna was not a beautiful ship. It had been built for war, not for comfort. And its iron-gray hull bore the scars of 100 battles that should have destroyed it. The vessel moved through space like a wounded predator, trailing faint wisps of radiation from engines that had been pushed far beyond their design limits. And inside its armored belly, 700 of humanity's worst nightmares prepared for combat. Captain Marcus Cole stood at the front of the ship's mess hall and looked out at his crew. They stared back at him with eyes that had seen things no human should ever see. Eyes that had done things no human should ever do. Every face told a story of violence and madness and despair. There was Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez, a woman who had once commanded a special forces unit and who had killed 37 enemy prisoners after they surrendered, her excuse being that they would have killed civilians if released. There was Viktor Krasinski, a former corporate assassin who had eliminated an entire board of directors and their families over a contract dispute. There was Sarah Chen, no relation to the director, a teenage prodigy who had hacked a space station's life support, and killed 2,000 people because voices in her head told her they were aliens wearing human skin. These were the damned. Each of them wore a black collar around their neck, smooth and seamless, and containing enough explosive to turn their heads into red mist if command decided they had become more trouble than they were worth. Each of them had been sentenced to death in a cell, alone and forgotten and denied even the dignity of a meaningful end. And each of them had chosen this instead. Cole himself had earned his place aboard the Gehenna 10 years ago, when he had commanded a destroyer during the Proxima Rebellion and had ordered his ship to fire on civilian transports that his superiors claimed were carrying weapons. They were not carrying weapons, they were carrying families. 3,000 innocent people fleeing the violence. And Cole had killed them all because he trusted orders more than his own eyes. The court-martial had been quick, the sentence had been death, and then the offer had come, whispered through the bars of his cell by a woman in a black uniform with no insignia, die in a box. She had said, "Or die fighting. And your crimes die with you. Your family gets your pension. Your name gets cleared from the records." What choice was there really? Cole had survived 47 deployments since then. More than any other captain in the history of the Penal Legion, he had led the damned into hell again and again. And somehow, impossibly, he kept walking out the other side, not because he was lucky, because he was already dead inside. And dead men have nothing left to fear. He cleared his throat, and the mess hall fell silent instantly. "Listen up," Cole said, his voice rough from years of shouting over gunfire and explosions. "We have a new mission, and I'm not going to lie to you about what it is." He activated the holographic display, and the tactical data from Keth 7 flickered into existence above his head. 40,000 alien civilians trapped on a mining colony, he said. 40 Drakevith warships in orbit, ground forces already landing, and their shields failing within hours. He let that sink in. The nearest friendly fleet is 3 weeks away, and we are the only ship in range. Someone in the back of the room laughed. A harsh and broken sound. "One ship against 40, Victor Krasinski said, his scarred face splitting into a grin that had no humor in it. "Captain, I think Command has finally lost their minds. Command has classified this as a suicide mission," Cole confirmed. "They expect us to delay the Drakevith long enough for the Confederacy fleet to arrive. And they do not expect any of us to survive." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, Elena Vasquez started laughing. It was a real laugh, genuine and almost joyful, and it spread through the mess hall like wildfire until 700 convicted killers were howling with dark amusement. Cole let them laugh. He understood it better than anyone. These were people who had been told they were going to die every single day since they came aboard the Gehenna. The only difference now was that someone was finally being honest about it. "Sir," Vasquez said when she finally caught her breath, "with all due respect, we've been dead since the moment we put on these collars. And what's one more grave to people who already live in one?" Cole nodded slowly. "That's what I thought you'd say." He killed the holographic display and looked out at his crew, his family of monsters, his collection of broken souls who had somehow found purpose in mutual destruction. "Here's how this is going to work," he said. "We hit the Drakevith fleet hard and fast, and we don't stop hitting them until they're dead, or we are. And I want every single one of you to remember something." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Those aliens down on that colony, they're civilians, and they have families, children, people who love them and want them to come home. And the Drakevith are going to take all of that away unless we stop them." He saw something shift in the eyes of his crew, something that might have been long-buried humanity stirring beneath the layers of violence and madness. "We didn't get to be heroes," Cole said softly. "We made choices, Bad choices, evil choices. And we became monsters because of them. But today, right now, we get a chance to be something else. He straightened his spine and set his jaw. Today, we get to die for something good. I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been waiting for that chance for 10 years. Viktor Krasinski rose to his feet, his massive frame blocking out the overhead lights. For the 40,000, he said. And his voice was rough with something that might have been emotion. For the 40,000, Vasquez echoed. Standing as well, one by one, the crew of the Gehenna rose to their feet. And the words spread through the mess hall like a prayer, like a promise, like a war cry from the throats of the damned. For the 40,000, Cole felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been frozen solid since the day he watched 3,000 civilians die on his orders. It hurt and felt like hope. All hands to battle stations, he said. And his voice was steady, even as his heart broke and reformed into something new. We arrive at Keth 7 in 4 hours. And God help any Drakevith who gets in our way. The Gehenna screamed through space at maximum burn, its engines glowing like angry stars, and inside its armored hull, 700 monsters prepared to become heroes, whether the universe was ready for them or not. First Contact War Master Kesrith had conquered 17 worlds in his long and bloody career. He had broken the spines of civilizations, scattered entire species to the cosmic winds, and built mountains from the bones of Brur. Those who dared resist the Drakevith dominion, he feared nothing in this galaxy or any other. That was about to change. The first sense that something was wrong came when his sensor officer made a sound that Kesrith had never heard before. A high-pitched whine of pure confusion that cut through the bridge like a blade. War Master, the officer said, his scales rippling with uncertainty. A ship has just emerged from fold space at the edge of the system. One ship? Kesrith demanded, turning from his observation of the burning colony below. Yes, War Master. And it appears to be human in origin. Kesrith's lipless mouth curved into something that might have been amusement on a less terrifying face. The humans were a young species, bold and reckless and entertaining in their delusions of significance. He had heard stories of their stubbornness, their refusal to accept defeat, their strange attachment to concepts like honor and sacrifice. He had always wanted to test those stories personally. One ship against 40, he mused, settling back into his command throne. Either the humans are fools, or this is a diplomatic vessel that wandered into our territory by mistake. Should we hail them, War Master? No, Kesrith decided. Let them approach, and let them see what awaits them, and when their courage breaks, we will add them to our collection. He returned his attention to the surface bombardment, watching with satisfaction as another Valorian settlement crumbled beneath his weapons. The humans would learn their place soon enough. 3 hours later, Kesrith learned the true meaning of miscalculation. The human ship came in fast. Too fast, pushing its engines past any reasonable safety margin and trailing fire from half a dozen small hull breaches. It did not slow down. It did not hail it. Did not behave like any military vessel Kesrith had ever encountered. It simply opened fire. The first 2 shots were almost beautiful in their precision. Twin beams of coherent energy that lanced across the void and struck the life support systems of Kesrith, flanking escorts, not the weapons, not the engines. Life support. Kesrith watched in stunned disbelief as 2 of his warships began venting atmosphere, their crews dying in the cold silence of space. And the human ship was already moving, already firing again. Its weapons targeting crew quarters and medical bays and anything else that would cause maximum casualties with minimum effort. This was not warfare. This was slaughter. All ships, concentrate fire on that vessel. Kesrith roared, his scales flushing dark with fury. "Destroy them immediately." His fleet responded with overwhelming force. 40 warships pouring destruction at a single target. And the human ship took hits that would have crippled any conventional vessel. Its hull cracked and burned sections exploded outward in blooming flowers of flame and debris, and still it kept coming. Kesrith's sensor officer was the first to notice the anomaly. "War Master," he said, and his voice was trembling now. "The human ship is not trying to evade our fire." "What?" "It's flying directly into our weapons, and it's not slowing down. It's accelerating." Kesrith felt something cold crawl up his spine. Something he had not experienced in decades of conquest. The human ship punched through his defensive line like a fist through paper, ignoring the damage it was taking, targeting ship after ship with that same terrible precision. 10 minutes into the battle, 6 Drakevith warships were dead or dying. 15 minutes in, that number had doubled, and the human ship, the Gehenna, according to its transponder signal, was still fighting, still firing, still refusing to acknowledge that it should have been destroyed 100 times over. "Hail them," Kesrith commanded, and he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "I want to see what manner of creatures we are facing." The communication link took several seconds to establish, and when the human commander's face appeared on Kesrith's screen, the War Master felt the cold thing in his spine spread to his heart. The human was smiling. His bridge was on fire behind him. Half of his crew appeared to be dead or dying at their stations, and he was smiling. A terrible expression that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with something far darker. "Drakevith vessel," the human said, and his voice was calm despite the chaos around him. "I am Captain Marcus Cole of the Penal Legion vessel Gehenna, and you have made a serious mistake." Kesrith forced his scales to settle, forced his voice to remain steady. "You are outnumbered and outgunned, human, and your ship is falling apart around you. So what possible threat do you imagine you pose to the Dominion?" The human's smile widened. "You don't understand what we are." "Do you? Explain yourself. We're not soldiers," Cole said. And behind him, his surviving crew members were laughing. Actually laughing as their ship burned and bled around them. "We're inmates, War Master. And every single person aboard this ship has been sentenced to death for crimes that would make your conquests look like children's games." Kesrith felt his certainty cracking, felt something like fear beginning to seep through the fractures. "You send criminals to fight your battles?" "We send our monsters," Cole corrected. "And you just gave us something to kill." The transmission ended on Kesrith's tactical display. The Gehenna executed a maneuver that should have been impossible for a ship so heavily damaged. It turned directly toward his flagship and it accelerated. Evasive action. Kesrith screamed, abandoning all pretense of composure. "All batteries target that ship. Destroy it now." But it was too late. The Gehenna slammed into his flagship's forward section with the force of a small asteroid, its armored prow punching through shields and hull plating alike for one eternal moment. Kesrith stared at the twisted metal and burning debris where his bridge used to end. Then the boarding alerts began to sound. They were coming aboard. The humans were coming aboard. And they were bringing all of their accumulated violence and madness with them. Kesrith drew his personal weapon and prepared to defend his command. He had conquered 17 worlds. He had broken countless civilizations. He had never, in all his years of warfare, faced anything like the creatures that came pouring through the breach in his ship's hull. They moved like predators, like demons, like the embodiment of every nightmare that the galaxy had ever produced, and they were laughing. They were laughing as they killed his soldiers. They were laughing as they took wounds that should have been fatal and kept fighting. They were laughing as they died, one by one, taking 10 Drakevith with them. For every human that fell, Kesrith finally understood. What the human captain had tried to tell him, these were not warriors seeking glory or soldiers following orders. These were the damned, the forsaken, the ones who had already accepted their deaths and were simply looking for a worthy way to end, and they had found it in the blood of his people, in the destruction of his fleet, in the impossible, unstoppable fury of creatures who had nothing left to lose. The devil's bargain on the surface of Keth 7. 40,000 Valorian colonists huddled in underground bunkers and prayed to gods they had almost forgotten above them. The Skyburn colony administrator Velanash stood at the observation window of the primary shelter, watching the impossible battle unfold in the heavens. Debris rained down through the atmosphere like falling stars, trailing fire and smoke as chunks of destroyed warships tumbled toward the surface. The Drakevith bombardment had stopped. That alone would have been miracle enough. But what Velanash was witnessing went far beyond miracles into territory that her scientific mind refused to accept. A single ship, one small and battered human vessel, was tearing the Drakevith fleet apart. She could hear fragments of the battle through the colony's emergency communication systems. Strange human voices shouting and laughing and screaming in languages her translator struggled to process. There was joy in those voices, terrible, broken, impossible joy. Administrator, one of her technicians, said, his voice trembling with a mixture of hope and horror. We're detecting something entering the atmosphere. More debris? No, ma'am, these trajectories are controlled, and they're heading directly for our position. Velanash felt her heart skip. Drakevith ground forces had already established a perimeter around the colony's failing shields, and they were preparing for a final assault that would break through within hours if these new contacts were reinforcements for the enemy. It was over, but if they were something else, can you identify them? They appear to be drop pods, ma'am, human military design. Approximately 200 units inbound. The technician paused, checking his readings twice before continuing. They're landing directly on top of the Drakevith positions. Velanash watched through the observation window as the first pods screamed out of the burning sky and slammed into the ground with enough force to shake the bunker's foundations for a moment. Nothing moved then. The pods opened, and nightmares stepped out. The humans who emerged from those pods were not like any soldiers Velanash had ever seen or studied. They wore black armor covered in scratches and burns and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. They carried weapons that seemed jury-rigged from a dozen different sources, held together with tape and determination. Many of them were wounded before they even touched the ground, bleeding from injuries that would have crippled a Valoriano. Of them stopped moving. Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez hit the ground rolling, her rifle already spitting death at the nearest Drakevith position beside her. Victor Krasinski rose from his pod with a roar that drowned out the sound of explosions, charging directly into enemy fire with nothing but a massive blade and a complete disregard for his own survival. Sarah Chan moved like a ghost, slipping between shadows and leaving dead Drakevith in her wake. Her eyes distant and unfocused, but her aim perfect. 200 of the damned had descended from the sky, and they were doing exactly what they had been trained to do. They were causing chaos. The Drakevith ground commander, a veteran of a dozen planetary conquests, tried to rally his forces against this new threat. He positioned his soldiers in defensive formations. He called for orbital support that no longer existed. He did everything that military doctrine demanded. None of it mattered. The humans did not fight like soldiers. They fought like wild animals, like forces of nature, like the physical manifestation of rage and desperation and something that might have been hope if it hadn't been dressed in so much blood. They did not take cover. When fired upon, they advanced. They did not call for backup. When outnumbered, they improvised. When they ran out of ammunition, they used their blades. When they ran out of blades, They used their hands when they ran out of hands. They used their teeth. Vilanash watched a human woman tackle a Drakevith warrior 3 times her size and proceed to beat him to death with a rock. She watched a human man take a blade through his chest, look down at it in mild annoyance, and then use the weapon still embedded in his body to kill 3 more enemies before finally collapsing. She watched things that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, and she heard them laughing. The humans were laughing as they fought, as they killed, as they died. It was the laughter of the insane, of the damned, of creatures who had abandoned all fear because they had already accepted the worst possible outcome. A young Valorian girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, her voice small and confused in the chaos. "Mama, why are they laughing? The humans are dying and they're laughing about it." The mother had no answer. She simply held her child closer and watched as monsters from another world gave everything they had to protect people they had never met. By the time dawn broke over Keth 7, the Drakevith ground forces had been shattered. 800 enemy soldiers dead, 200 drop pods that had landed, 83 humans still standing. Vasquez surveyed the battlefield with exhausted eyes, taking stock of who had survived and who had finally found the peace they had been seeking. Viktor Krasinski was dead. His massive body sprawled across a pile of Drakevith corpses, a smile frozen on his ruined face. Sarah Chun was dead, shot through the head while protecting a group of Valorian children who had been caught outside the shelters. So many of them were dead, but not all, not enough to make the mission a failure. Perimeter secure. Vasquez reported into her communicator, her voice hoarse from hours of screaming orders and battle cries. Drakevith ground forces eliminated. Civilian population intact. Static crackled for a moment before Captain Cole's voice came through, weak but unmistakable. "Good work, Sergeant Major. And the orbital situation is contained as well. Since what's left of the Drakevith fleet is running for the edge of the system. What about the Gehenna, sir?" A pause, a long, terrible pause. "The ship is gone, Vasquez, and we had to abandon her after the ram. But we took the War Master's flagship with us when we went." Vasquez closed her eyes. "How many, sir?" 62 survivors from the orbital engagement, and were in escape pods heading for the surface. 62 out of 500 who had stayed aboard for the Space Battle 83 from the ground. Assault 145 survivors out of 700 who had answered the call. It was the worst casualty rate in the history of the Penal Legion. It was also the most successful mission ever completed. Vasquez opened her eyes and looked around at the Valorian colonists emerging from their bunkers, their strange alien faces filled with a mixture of fear and wonder and something that might have been gratitude. 40,000 lives saved, 145 monsters who had finally done something good. Math worked out. It would always work out. Understood, Captain, Vasquez said, and her voice was steady even as something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in her chest. "We'll be here when you land." She lowered her communicator and turned to face the rising sun somewhere in the distance. A child was crying. It was the most beautiful sound she had heard in years. What remains the Confederacy fleet arrived 3 weeks later to find a graveyard ambassador. Thelvan stood on the observation deck of the diplomatic cruiser and stared at the debris field that had once been the mightiest Drakevith Armada in the Sector. 26 warships drifted dead in orbit, their hulls cracked open to vacuum, their crews long since frozen in the endless cold of space. 14 more had fled into the darkness between stars, spreading word of what had happened at Keth 7 to every corner of Drakevith territory and floating among the wreckage, broken beyond any hope of repair, but still broadcasting its defiance on all frequencies. Was the Gehenna. The human ship was barely recognizable as a vessel anymore. Its hull had been torn open in a dozen places. Its engines were cold and dark, and entire sections had been completely destroyed during the battle. but its transponder was still active, still pulsing out the same message over and over again. This is the Penal Legion vessel Gehenna, and Keth 7 is under human protection. Thalvan felt her tendrils curl with an emotion she could not quite name. Horror, perhaps, or awe, something that combined both into a feeling that defied translation. Ambassador, her aide said softly. The shuttle is ready to take us to the surface. Thalvan nodded slowly, still unable to tear her eyes away from the silent testament of human sacrifice that hung in the void before her. How many of them survived? 104, according to the latest reports. 104 out of 700. Thul Van closed her eyes and tried to comprehend what she was. Hearing these humans had known the odds before they arrived. They had known that most of them would die, and they had come anyway, had fought anyway, had given everything they had. For people they had never met and a world they had no connection to. Why? What possible motivation could drive species to sacrifice so much for so little return? The shuttle ride to the surface was silent. Thulvan spent most of it reviewing the combat recordings that the colony's remaining satellites had captured. Watching the impossible battle unfold from every available angle, she saw the Gehenna ram into the Drakeveth flagship. She saw the drop pods fall like vengeful stars. She saw humans die in ways that should have broken them, only to rise again and again until their bodies simply refused to function anymore. By the time the shuttle landed, she thought she understood. She was wrong. The surviving humans had established a camp near the colony's primary shelter, a collection of salvaged equipment and emergency supplies that looked almost pathetic compared to the sophisticated Valorian technology surrounding it. But it was not the camp that caught Thalvan's attention. It was the humans themselves. They were sitting with the colonists, not standing guard, not maintaining military discipline, not behaving like the terrifying warriors she had witnessed in the recordings. They were sitting in small groups, sharing rations with Valorian families, letting children examine their scars and their equipment with curious fingers. Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez was teaching a young Valorian boy something that involved small rectangular cards, and both of them were laughing at whatever mistake he had just made. A massive human with burns covering half his face was holding a Valorian infant with the gentleness of a parent, rocking the child slowly while its mother slept nearby. These were the same creatures who had torn through the Drakeveth forces like angels of death. These were the same monsters who had laughed while they killed and killed while they died, and now they were playing cards with children and singing soft songs to babies. Thalvan approached Vasquez slowly, uncertain of what she should say or how she should say it. The human woman looked up at her approach, and for a moment, something ancient and tired flickered in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by a calm friendliness that seemed almost rehearsed. Ambassador, Vasquez said, rising to her feet with a wince that suggested hidden injuries. I was told you'd be coming down to see us. Sergeant Major Vasquez, Thalvan replied, her translator struggling with the unfamiliar rank. I came to express the gratitude of the Valorian Confederacy for what you and your people have done. Vasquez's expression shifted, became something harder to read. We did our job, Ambassador. And that's all there is to it. Your job, Thalvan repeated, and she could not keep the disbelief from her voice. You'd call sacrificing 600 lives a job? I call it an opportunity. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that Thalvan could not quite grasp. I don't understand, she admitted finally. Your records, the things you and your crew have done, the crimes you committed before coming here, and yet you risked everything for people you've never met. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant when she spoke again. Her voice was softer than Thalvan had expected. Everyone deserves a chance to die for something good. Ambassador, she paused, and something almost like pain crossed her scarred face. Most people never get that chance. And they live their whole lives wondering if they would have been brave enough, strong enough, good enough to sacrifice everything for something that mattered. She looked around at the surviving damned, at the Valorian families they had fought and died to protect. We got 40,000 chances, Ambassador, and that's more than any of us ever dreamed we would get. Thelvan felt something shift in her understanding of the universe. She had come here expecting to find monsters who had accidentally done something heroic instead. She found broken people who had chosen to be heroes despite everything they had lost. Captain Cole, she said slowly. I was told he did not survive the orbital battle. Vasquez's expression flickered. He died getting his people off the Gehenna before it tore itself apart, and he was the last one out the door. Made sure everyone who could make it to the escape pods got there first. She straightened her spine, and for a moment, Thelvan saw the warrior beneath the tired woman. He died like he lived, sir. And he put his crew first right up until the end. Thelvan nodded slowly. I will ensure that his sacrifice is remembered by my people, with respect. Ambassador, don't. Thelvan blinked in surprise. Don't remember him? Don't make us into heroes, Vasquez clarified, her voice firm. We're not heroes, and we never were, and we never will be. Because we're criminals who got lucky enough to die for something other than our own mistakes. She looked back at the Valorian boy she had been teaching cards to, and her expression softened. Just remember the 40,000. Ambassador, and remember that someone cared enough to fight for them. And that's all the legacy any of us ever wanted. Thelvan watched the deadliest humans in existence play cards with children and share food with families and sing quiet songs to babies who would never know how close they had come to slavery and death, and she realized finally that she understood nothing about humanity at all 3 months later. The Drakevith Dominion sued for peace there. Surrender document contained many clauses about territory and reparations and the release of enslaved populations. But there was one clause that stood out from all the others. One demand that the Drakevith negotiators had insisted upon with an intensity that bordered on desperation. No Drakevith vessel shall engage any human ship bearing the designation Penal Legion. When the Confederacy representatives asked why this clause was so important, the Drakevith ambassador refused to answer. He simply trembled and looked away, and in the archives of the Valorian homeworld, in a file that would be studied by historians for generations to come, someone had inscribed a quote from an anonymous human source. We were already dead, and you just gave us a reason to stop. The words of the damned, the legacy of the forgotten. Truth about humanity that the galaxy was only beginning to understand.